sometimes even in the Air Force circles, is the role played by unheralded aviation assets. Today, we'll stick to two, Howards and Vampires. Howard, a trainer aircraft, and Vampire, also a trainer at that point of time. So the second half of which the coordinator will announce would be the impact of air dominance in the east, and that would be a discussion with Air Marshal Harish Masad on the eastern part. But first, Howards and Vampires. To discuss this, we have Mr. Jagan Mohan, and most of you know Jagan, a historian par excellence, 3 books on the Indian Air Force, several other projects, editor of Bharat Rakshak, which in a way is a de facto official website, if I may say so, of the 3 services, certainly of the Air Force. He was awarded the Chief of Air Staff's commendation in 2007, a fellowship from the USI to write a book, and the famous book of his, Eagles over Bangladesh. But before I get Jagan on, Jagan, welcome, I can see you on the screen. Let me first show you 2 slides of Howard just to depict exactly who all were there. So we had the Air Force formed an ad hoc squadron, 1, 2, 3 ad hoc squadron, which operated from Sirsa and Rajouri. All of you know where Rajouri is. Next slide, please. Next slide. And this was the group of people led by a group captain Ware, who rose to Air Commodore and retired, and his son is Group Captain Charles Ware, privileged to be his coursemate, my coursemate. I am privileged to be his coursemate. And these are the pioneers of Howard operations. A.M. Oza, Grupi Ware, K.B. Singh, Raja Suri, and Barbara. I had a long chat with Raja Suri, and I said, sir, please send me some photographs. He said, I have no photographs, actually. But to keep my memories alive, next slide, please. He said, I did this painting. Next slide. He said, this is what I remember. And this is what I painted on acrylic. Howard's, and that's the Rajouri ALG. So, next slide, please, the blank slide. So after this, let's talk now to Jagan. Jagan, please throw some light on how the Howard trainer came into the contention for the strike rate.
Well, first, thank you very much for this welcome, AVM Bahadur, sir. It's my privilege to be talking about these unheralded squadrons of the IAF in the 71 Ops. So I know a lot of our audience are already aware of the 1971 war air operations. They pretty much know the headline grabbing air battles and the glamorous stories of those operations already. And most of these are with the frontline combat aircraft like the MiG-21s, Sukhoi 7s, Canberras, Hunters, etc. The Howards and the Vampires, which we are going to talk about later, are from the not so glamorous second line aircraft that were being used as trainers at that time. The Howard in particular was a Second World War II era piston engined aircraft powered by a Pratt and Whitney Wasp radial engine. The one that we are talking about that were used in 71 were what the AF acquired in the early 50s, but they really date back to the Second World War. At that time, they were being used as advanced trainers with the Air Force Academy, as well as the Flying Instructor School. And what the Indian Air Force decided is they had very well laid out plans for the frontline squadrons, attacking, providing close air support, air bases, strategic targets, etc. But what they felt was a gap in providing close air support in mountainous regions. For example, in the Kashmir Valleys sector, the high-speed jets cannot effectively operate at low level, cannot provide accurate and effective close air support. So the thought came out within Western Air Command: can we make use of slower aircraft? And at that time, in their arsenal were the Howard trainers and the Vampire fighters, which we'll speak later on. So as Squadron Leader Captain Suri to had later captain in the Air India has Raja Suri told us, the Howards were taken to Hindon, and the the engineers had worked on what we call, we are very favorite of this word called Jugar. The Howards originally were unarmed. The version that we operated could not deliver ordnance. So they rigged up electricals using spare parts from the Hunter squadrons, and they were able to equip the Howard to carry at least 6 of the T-10 rockets, 3 under the each wing. And using the Hunter electrical box installed in the cockpit, the pilots would have been able to operate the rockets, one pair at a time. And all this was done in the weeks leading up to the operations. The first 2 weeks leading up to the operations.
Yeah, Jagan. So these mods of T-10 rockets was done, and I was speaking to somebody who was there at that point of time, and the point was that actually when they put the avionics on, the compass would just drift off by 30 degrees. So this was the jugaad, as Jagan said, they were there. But what were the roles assigned, Jagan, to the Texans operating from Rajouri?
So the initially the Texans were sent to provide close air support to the 25th Mountain Division, I believe, the Ace of Spades Division under General Kundan Singh. Right, there was a concern that the Pakistanis will try the same infiltration tactics from 1965 by sending in irregular militia as well as arms and equipment to create chaos behind Indian lines. So the Howards were tasked at undertaking recce sorties, disrupting the supply lines, and also in attacking pillboxes and other installations in support of that particular division in that specific area. Parallelly, a couple of hours were also sent south to Sirsa to see if they can be utilized in undertaking nighttime recce and interdiction sorties. But as you mentioned, there were challenges using the compass, and nighttime navigation wasn't easy in the in those circumstances.
Yeah, okay. And in fact, one of the ways that the pilots, they realized that when they were flying in the hills of Rajouri and strafing the Pakistani posts out there, all the ack was coming and bursting in ahead of the aircraft, and then they realized that those guys were trained for the high speed of fighter aircraft, whereas the Texan was a trainer. So the lead-in that was required to intercept the aircraft, you lead ahead when you fire, should have been lesser for the slow-moving this particular aircraft that was there, the Texan. So there were these intrepid pilots, 7 of them, who operated the Texans out there. Now, due to shortage of time, I think we need to move from the Texan to a different aircraft. Absolutely, the first jet actually which came into the Indian Air Force. And let's switch to vampires, Jagan. Just a few slides of that. Okay, this was another ad hoc squad, and this was formed at 2 places, Halwara and Srinagar. The vampires, they were pulled out, and some very minor modifications done. But this is a shot of the vampire in Srinagar, a trainer aircraft. Next slide. That's the commanding officer of the squadron, a Flight Lieutenant Manjeet Singh Sehgal, now retired as an Air Marshal, and he's addressing his airmen out there in Srinagar. Next slide, please. This is the vampire that was taken from Hakimpet Fighter Training Wing and was operating from Halwara. And when it landed back there, this was the graffiti on the vampire. Wing Commander Marshall was heading that detachment at Halwara. So this is what a vampire never, the aircraft could never have thought that it would get this sort of a paint scheme. Next slide, please. Okay, no, that's all. Thank you. Okay, Jagan, let's speak to the vampires, which got moved to Halwara and Srinagar. Now, what role did they perform? Because we know the problems with the vampire, slow-moving jet, and in the 65 war, if you recollect, we lost 3 vampires and Chum in the very first strike when they were taken off from Pathankot. They stopped, they gave the time required to the army, of course, but we had lost 3, or I think it was 4 vampires. So, Jagan, over to you. What roles were given to them, knowing the history, but they were repositioned at Srinagar?
Yeah, as you mentioned, the vampires were no longer serving with any of the flying squadrons of the Air Force at that time. They were only equipping the fighter training wing in Hakimpet just to provide introductory jet training to the pilots coming out of the AFA. And the role was sort of similar to what was designed for the Howard. The Pakistani positions in the high mountain ranges in the Kargil, Srinagar, and Poonch area. That was the original task. When the aircraft were sent, they were split into 2 detachments. One detachment was the single seaters that went to Srinagar. The other detachment, as you mentioned, went to Halwara, which were the 2 seaters. The reason this was split was they decided that basing all these aircraft at Srinagar was a risk, and they diverted the 2 seaters to undertake night interdiction missions over Pakistan. Uh, as you mentioned, the single-seater detachment under then Flight Lieutenant Manjit Singh Sekon was able to carry out several strikes against the Pakistani army formations, took active participation in the Kargil sector, including retaking of several mountain peaks, which helped the Indian Army retake several mountain peaks back into our control. Um, and the detachment at Halwara, which was again led by Wing Commander Marshall, focused mostly on nighttime interdiction against railway marshalling yards as well as the Grand Trunk Road, the targets along the Grand Trunk roads. The Because for nighttime operations they needed a crew of 2 members, one crew member to navigate using the clock and the map, the other one to fly. And there are a lot of stories as to how they identify targets in the dark moonlight, uh, and by DR navigation techniques. That on the other side, they were thinking they were being held by intelligence on the ground, saboteurs on the ground. So the accuracy with which they delivered these strikes is a whole story altogether.
Yeah, the vampires operating from Halwara, their navigation at night was just compass and the clock. Why they were sent at night was basically because they had no protection, that's number one, slow speed. And any railway station or a railway line is visible even in the darkest of nights. So they were given this task, basically to strike marshalling yards. Whereas the aircraft at Halwara, at Srinagar, they did a yeoman service in the hills, right? Actually, they went into Rajouri also, up to Gurez, all those hills. And special mention is of that point 13620, right above Kargil, which we got, and almost 30 odd posts which the army took along the Batalik Valley and up north further. The vampires were there in full strength. I had the good fortune of speaking with one of the pilots that time, Flight Lieutenant Quatra. He's in Mao now. And he spoke about this, and he said that when we went in for strikes in all these areas, it was a lot of ingenuity on the part of the pilots that was there. So with these vampires out there, and not a single loss. That's the important part. Despite the antiquity of the aircraft, I think only one aircraft got hit. There were a lot of Veer Chakras that were given, Flight Lieutenant Sekho, Flight Lieutenant Quatra, and one more officer, they got Veer Chakra and a mention in dispatch. So this is what was done. And since we have a little time, Jagan, let's speak a bit about the AN-12 bombing. The AN-12, we all know, was a transport aircraft, that time our heavy lift. That was used in the bombing role. A few words on the AN-12, Jagan.
Yes, sir. So, one word I would like to add is that all the officers and the airmen who accompanied these ad hoc squadrons we're talking about were volunteers.
Yes.
They, 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 they could have, some of them actually left desk jobs or staff jobs and say, I want to fly, and they went out of their way to seek action. We should call that out. Um, Coming to the AN-12s, AN-12s, as people who would probably know, is was primarily a transport aircraft, and we had two squadrons, number 44 and number 25. Leading up to the 71 war, again in the grand scheme of things, when the plans were drawn, a decision was taken to use the AN-12s as carpet bombers. And that point of time, the commanding officer, under the leadership of Wing Commander Vasist, EP Vasist, later AVM, the squadron was able to carry out multiple nighttime carpet bombing strikes against various strategic targets. That literally kept pressure on the Pakistani army, both in the east as well as in the west. Again, several missions ranging from Rajasthan all the way up to Skardu airfield will take a completely new session for us to discuss that in detail.
That's right. And actually, Wing Commander Vashisht got a Mahavir Chakra for that, for those missions out there, besides a few more of those pilots. And what Jagan spoke about the volunteering part, the Texan, Group Captain Bertie Ware, he was actually a group captain at that point of time working in air headquarters, and he volunteered to go and, as part, to lead those Texans, the Harvard trainers. And so was the case with many of these pilots. For example, Flight Lieutenant Quatra was in Hakimpet, and he volunteered to go there. So in closing, with respect to these anti-aircraft that were used, all I'll say is that ingenuity was the hallmark of all those operations. Ingenuity, you can call it jugaad, but I think let's use a better word, and which is ingenuity, which was there. AN-12s we've spoken of, and Caribou was used in the bombing role in the east also. It showed the guts of the pilots in taking on the roles that required improvisation and were downright risky. There are no two ways about it. You can't use any other word. And the ability of the technical staff, let's not forget them, the men behind the machines who work day in and day out to make sure that those machines were airworthy, had been modified to help the pilots do the mission. Thank you very much, Jagan. It's more than midnight out there in the US, I know. You have indeed educated us and the audience. To you, and have a good night's sleep. Thank you. We'll now switch to the east. And let's discuss the impact of air dominance in the east.